Deep within your soul, a sacred flame burns, a light that God Himself kindled the moment you came into being. Not in distant temples or dusty scriptures, but in every heartbeat, every breath, God resides, whispering that you were born for a higher purpose. Your life is not a random string of days, but a grand poem written with divine inspiration, waiting for you to discover and live out your mission fully. Today, I will tell you the story of John, an ordinary man whose life through the light of God within him became an extraordinary journey, a journey in which perhaps you may see yourself. Twilight settled over the small road leading into a peaceful town where wooden houses nestled under ancient oak trees. John, a 58-year-old man, stepped out of his garage, his hands still stained with engine oil after a day of fixing cars. His eyes, etched with the wrinkles of time, held a quiet contemplation. He paused, wiping his hands on an old rag, and looked up at the sky. In that fleeting moment of stillness, something stirred within John, a wordless question. What, after all, is my life for whom? John wasn't a regular churchgoer, nor was he one for meditation or philosophical books. He was a mechanic, a father, a husband, living a simple life like so many others. But tonight, as the last light of day spilled over the familiar road, he felt a profound presence, as if a small flame burned steadily in his chest. It wasn't a booming voice from the heavens or a miraculous sign, but a simple truth God, or some divine essence, lived within him in every heartbeat. To tell John's story, one might think it unremarkable. He grew up in a middle-class family, once dreamed of being a pilot, but ended up following his father's trade in the garage. He married Mary, his high school sweetheart, and they raised 2 children now grown and gone. His days were a cycle, waking early to make coffee, fixing cars, eating dinner with his wife, occasionally watching a baseball game on TV. Yet what made a man like John, with a seemingly ordinary life, carry a sacred light? It was because, like the flame in his heart, every person is created with a purpose, a mission that is quiet but profoundly meaningful. Consider the moment John stood silently under the sunset. He didn't know that in that stillness he was touching a truth. Ancient prophets once whispered, God doesn't dwell in far-off places or solemn rituals, but within him, in the days he patiently fixed cars, in the times he held Mary as she cried for their children, in the nights he lay awake worrying about his family's future. Every action, every moment, however small, was a thread in the sacred tapestry of his life. As a young man, John thought a person's worth lay in grand achievements, a prestigious job, a big house, or lavish vacations. But now, with gray in his hair, he was beginning to see something else true. Value isn't what you earn, but what you carry from birth. Every drop of sweat on the garage floor, every comforting word to a worried customer, every hand held with Mary in tough times, all were proof that he was more than a mechanic. He was a living temple where God placed his light. The miracle is that John didn't need to change the world to live with that light. He didn't need to preach from a pulpit or write a bestseller. In his small garage, when he smiled at a stranger, taught an apprentice how to tighten a bolt, or listened to Mary recount her day, he was fulfilling his mission. That mission wasn't loud or glamorous, but it was sacred, guided by the flame in his heart, lit by God the day he was born. As John stepped into the house, closing the garage door, he didn't realize that his quiet moment under the sunset had awakened something deep in his soul. He began to feel that his life, however simple, wasn't a string of meaningless days. Every step, every choice, every smile he gave was a line in the grand poem God was writing. And he, with his rough hands and honest heart, was the one bringing that light to the world day by day, moment by moment. The kitchen light flickered on Mary preparing dinner, the smell of grilled meat wafting through. John sat at the table looking at his wife, and for the first time in years he felt a deep gratitude, not just for what he had, but for his very existence. He didn't need to seek God elsewhere. He was already here in this house, in that garage, in his heart, and had been for a long time. The light from the desk lamp in the living room cast shadows on John's face as he sat in the old armchair holding a cold cup of coffee. Outside, the chirping of insects mingled with the soft rustle of wind through the trees. Mary had gone to bed, and the house was steeped in silence, leaving only John and his wandering thoughts. Tonight, he didn't turn on the TV as usual. Instead, he let his mind drift to days gone by, and a strange feeling arose, as if he were seeing his life not just through the eyes of a mechanic, but through the light of something greater. Yesterday, at the garage, an old customer named Bill stopped by. Bill, a widower, often brought his rickety pickup truck for repairs, but John knew he came for more than just the truck. Today, Bill spoke of loneliness, of the long, empty days since his wife passed. John, as always, listened. He wasn't good with flowery words, but he handed Bill a cold bottle of water, patted his shoulder, and said, "Take it slow, Bill. Things will be all right." As Bill drove off, John didn't think much of the moment. But now in the quiet room, he realized that small act listening, comforting being present, was how he brought his sacred light into the world. From the outside, John's life might seem unremarkable, but through the lens of the divine, every day he lived was an act of worship. The mornings he woke early to make coffee for Mary before she stirred, the times he patiently fixed cars for customers despite exhaustion, the nights he wrote letters to his son far away knowing replies were rare, all were golden threads weaving the tapestry of a life marked by God. He didn't need grand deeds to live divinely. In the simplest acts, he was fulfilling his mission to be a living temple where kindness, sincerity, and selfless love were offered freely. As a young man, John thought a meaningful life meant hitting big milestones, a bigger garage, a hefty bank account, or at least a Hawaii vacation Mary always dreamed of. But now, with the years behind him, he understood that meaning wasn't in tangible things. It was in how he chose to live each day, how he treated those around him, how he kept the fire in his heart burning despite life's blows. Once, after a long day of arguing about money, Mary told him, "John, you don't need to give me the world. Just being here like this is enough." He'd laughed it off then, but now he saw that his presence, with all its sincerity, was the most sacred gift he could give. Living divinely for John didn't mean becoming a saint or abandoning his garage to preach. It was choosing kindness over anger, forgiveness over resentment, truth over comfort. Once a young customer, furious over a higher-than-expected repair bill, shouted at John in front of others. Though his blood boiled, John took a deep breath, calmly explained each charge, and even discounted the bill. As the young man left, John felt a strange relief, not for keeping a customer, but for choosing the path he believed the God within him would take. That moment, though uncelebrated, was a quiet declaration that he was living with sacred light. But John didn't always feel strong. Some days, when the garage was slow, when Mary fell ill, when he worried about unpaid loans, he felt worn down. Some nights he lay awake haunted by past mistakes, like the time he yelled at his daughter for dropping out of college, or when he forgot Mary's birthday consumed by work. Yet in those moments of weakness, John realized God didn't demand perfection. He only asked for effort for John to clean the temple of his soul with humility and sincerity. Every time he apologized to Mary, every time he called his daughter to say, "I miss you," he was sweeping the corners of his heart, letting the sacred light shine clearer. Tonight, as his coffee grew cold, John turned off the living room lamp, and climbed the stairs. Before entering the bedroom, he paused at a family photo on the wall, a snapshot from 10 years ago camping by the lake. He smiled not out of nostalgia, but because he realized every day he lived, however ordinary, was a chance to bring love and kindness to those around him. He didn't need to seek God far away. He was here in the gentle words he spoke to Mary, in the reassuring pats on Bill's shoulder, in the days he chose to rise despite exhaustion. His life in all its simplicity was a sacred song written in small but meaningful acts. As John lay beside Mary listening to her steady breathing, he felt a deep peace. He knew tomorrow he'd rise early, make coffee open the garage, and keep living as he had today, not to prove anything, but to honor the sacred flame in his heart. And in that simplicity, he was fulfilling his mission day by day, moment by moment. Morning sunlight slipped through the window blinds, spilling onto the worn wooden kitchen floor. John stood by the counter holding the coffee pot, pouring dark, rippling liquid into Mary's favorite white ceramic mug. The soft hiss of the coffee maker blended with the chirping of birds outside, creating a familiar morning symphony. It was Saturday. The garage closed, but John still rose early out of habit. He set the mug on the table for Mary, then stepped onto the porch, settling into the old rocking chair, gazing at the path leading into town. In this quiet moment, a thought sparked in his mind. His life, it seemed, wasn't just for himself, but a story told through every action, every moment. John never saw himself as a preacher. He wasn't comfortable with speeches, didn't know scripture by heart, and never stood before a crowd to speak of faith. But this morning, watching oak leaves drift across the yard, he realized his life in all its simplicity was a living sermon. Every day he lived, every choice he made, every handshake, every smile, they were verses written in action, needing no pulpit or robe. And that he understood was how the God within him spoke to the world. Yesterday, at the grocery store, John ran into Helen, an elderly neighbor living alone. Her trembling hands dropped a can of beans onto the floor. John, browsing bread nearby, didn't hesitate to pick it up and carried her bags to her car. "Thank you, John," Helen said, her eyes glistening. "You always make me feel the world's still kind." John just smiled, nodded, and returned to his truck. He didn't think it was a big deal, but now on the porch, he saw that moment wasn't just a small act. It was a line in the sacred poem of his life, proof that God lived in him in the way he paused, helped, and brought hope to a lonely soul. John's life was full of such moments, their significance unnoticed, until he looked back. Like the time he spent an afternoon with Tommy, the new apprentice, at the garage, a 17-year-old who'd dropped out due to family hardship. Tommy was clumsy, making constant mistakes, but John didn't yell. Instead, he patiently showed him how to hold a wrench, how to listen to an engine's hum to diagnose a problem. When Tommy finally fixed a car on his own, his grin lit up like he'd conquered the world. "Thanks, Uncle John," he said, voice thick. John just patted his shoulder, but warmth spread in his chest. He didn't know that to Tommy he wasn't just a mechanic, but a lighthouse guiding a lost soul. These moments, John now understood, weren't random. They were brushstrokes on the canvas of his life where God used his hands to touch those around him. Once Mary told him about a woman from her book club who broke down sharing her crumbling marriage. Mary, with her gentle heart, invited her to dinner. John, tired from a long day, still joined them, telling light-hearted garage stories to ease the mood. After dinner, the woman held their hands, saying, "Thank you both. Tonight's the first time in months I didn't feel alone." John thought he was just doing the usual, but now he saw that dinner was an altar where love and kindness were offered, and God was present at their kitchen table. Living as a sermon for John didn't mean doing extraordinary things. It was how he chose to rise each day, carrying the sacred light in his heart and letting it shine through the smallest acts. Some days were hard, when the garage was empty, when Mary was sick, when he worried about unpaid loans. Some nights he wondered if he was doing it right, if his life truly mattered. But in those moments of doubt, John realized his sermon wasn't in perfection, but in persistence. Every time he held back anger with a difficult customer, called his busy son, or sat quietly with Mary when she needed silence, he was writing a new verse, not with words, but with how he lived. The other day, at the town's small coffee shop, John overheard young people talking about the world's chaos, the flood of negative news. A girl sighed. "I don't know what to believe anymore." John, at the next table, didn't join in, but smiled at her as he paid, saying, "Keep being kind, kid. The world'll be okay." She looked surprised, then nodded. John didn't know that brief comment planted a seed of hope in her heart. He didn't need a pulpit to inspire. His life, in all its sincerity, was a living sermon resonating in moments he didn't even notice. As John rose from the rocking chair to get more coffee, he paused at the hallway mirror. His eyes, though dimmed by age, still sparkled with life. He didn't see himself as special, but he was beginning to understand that every day he lived, every person he touched was part of a greater story. He was a mechanic, a husband, a father, but more, he was a temple where God wrote tales of kindness, forgiveness, and hope. And his sermon, though unapplauded, was quietly changing the world one person at a time. In the kitchen, Mary was up reading the paper. John poured himself coffee and sat across from her. "What do you want to do today?" he asked gently. Mary looked up, smiling. "Just being here with you is enough." John nodded, a deep peace spreading within. He knew today, like every day, was a chance to continue his sermon, not with words, but with how he loved, stayed present, and carried the sacred light in his heart to those around him. Rain pattered softly outside the window, droplets sliding down the glass in blurry streaks. John sat in a corner of the garage next to a customer's old pickup truck, wrench in hand, but eyes distant. The steady tap of rain on the tin roof mingled with a crackling country song on the radio, but John's mind was elsewhere. Today was heavy. That morning, the bank called the loan for the garage was still unpaid, and they warned of foreclosure if he couldn't manage soon. In his heart, a storm brewed, not from the weather outside, but from quiet worries, doubts, and fears. At 58, John was no longer the fiery young man who thought he could conquer any challenge. Life had taught him that sometimes, no matter how hard you try, trials crash in like unannounced waves. He recalled past hardships: the year Mary was diagnosed with arthritis, the months the garage sat empty after a flood, the year he and his eldest son fought so bitterly they didn't speak for a year. Each time, John felt he faced an unclimbable mountain. But today, in the garage, amid the rain and familiar smell of oil, a small spark flickered in his soul, not a promise that all would be well, but a deep truth. God was still here within him, even in the storms. Faith for John wasn't something flashy or easy. It wasn't kneeling in church or reading a Bible verse and feeling troubles dissolve. His faith was forged in dark days, in nights spent awake worrying for his family, in moments he questioned if he had the strength to go on. Today, staring at the wrench in his hand, he remembered an afternoon years ago when he nearly gave up. The garage was on the brink of bankruptcy, and John considered selling it to work in a factory. Mary then took his hand, looked into his eyes, and said, "John, you don't have to do it all alone. Just keep going, and that's enough." Those words, like a small lamp, guided him forward. Now he saw they weren't just Mary's, but God's whisper within him, reminding him he was never alone. John's resilience didn't come from superhuman strength or miracles. It came from moments when he chose to stand even when his legs trembled, like the time he kept the garage open working late to fix cars for free for a family who couldn't pay, or when he wrote a long letter to his son apologizing for harsh words years before, unsure if he'd respond. That letter, after months, led to a surprise call from his son, voice-choked, "Dad, I miss you." In that moment, John felt a weight lift from his chest. He realized faith wasn't certainty that all would be well, but daring to step forward despite an unclear path, trusting the God within him to guide. Today, amid the rain and bank news, John faced another foggy road. But instead of letting fear drown him, he took a deep breath, set the wrench down, and pulled a scrap of paper from a drawer. He began writing a list of what he could do: call old customers, negotiate loan payments, even sell his beloved old motorcycle. Each shaky pen stroke was an act of faith. He didn't know if these plans would save the garage, but he knew that trying even with a heavy heart was how he kept the sacred flame in him burning. That afternoon, the rain stopped, and Bill, the widowed customer, dropped by. Bill brought a meat sandwich from a nearby diner, saying he wanted to thank John for listening the week before. The two men sat on toolboxes, eating, chatting about trivial things: weather, baseball, tough times. Bill shared that he'd joined a church community group inspired by John's advice to step out, you might find something. Hearing this, John felt warmth spread within. He hadn't realized his simple words had become a lamp for Bill, helping him rediscover meaning. As Bill left, John resumed work on the truck. Each turn of a bolt, each wipe of a part felt like cleaning not just the vehicle but his soul. He thought of Mary smiling despite aching joints, of his daughter working far away but calling weekly, of Tommy the apprentice now more confident. All of them in some way were part of John's journey, a journey of an ordinary man with a sacred strength forged through storms. As night fell, John locked the garage and walked home. The familiar path glimmered under moonlight, mirroring the light in his heart. He recalled a saying, "The tree by the river stays green, even in drought comes." John felt like that tree rooted in faith, leaves reaching up despite life's harshness. He didn't know what tomorrow held, but he knew the God within him, the flame he'd learned to cherish, would never fade. And as long as he kept walking, however slowly, however tired, he would weather this storm just as he had so many before. Entering the house, Mary was knitting on the sofa under soft golden light. John sat beside her, saying nothing, holding her hand. She looked up, smiled, and in that moment, John felt peace. He knew no matter how chaotic that world, the temple in his heart stood firm. And with that faith, he was ready to face whatever lay ahead, for he did not walk alone. Soft autumn sunlight spilled over the path from John's home to the small town, golden red oak leaves falling gently, twirling in the light breeze. John walked slowly, his old boots crunching on the gravel path, hands in pockets, breath mingling with the crisp air. Today was a rare day off from the garage, not because business was slow, but because he wanted time for himself. At 58, John seldom thought of grand adventures or big changes, but this morning a strange sense of freedom stirred within, not freedom from work or duty, but a deeper, as if he'd just loosed an invisible chain that had bound his soul for years. John paused by a grand oak, leaning against its rough bark, gazing at the clear blue sky through its leafy canopy. He reflected on the years gone by, the decades he'd lived to meet others' expectations, customers, family, even society's silent demands. He'd once believed a man like him had to be tough, successful, with a bustling garage, a fine house, and a spotless life. But now, under the oak's shade, John saw those expectations weren't his own, but those of a clamorous world always trying to shape who he was. And in this serene moment, he felt a holy defiance, not against anyone, but against what had made him forget God's light within him. Freedom for John wasn't about fleeing to some far-off isle. It was an inner unshackling, a choice to live true to the sacred fire in his heart, heedless of whispers or judging eyes. He recalled an evening weeks ago at the town's small diner where John and he and Mary celebrated their 30th anniversary. A nearby group at the next table, old school friends, chatted about those who'd made it, big houses, companies, world trips. John, hearing them, felt a twinge of self-doubt. His garage struggled. His home was the same old wooden place, and that Hawaii dream vacation stayed a dream. But then Mary squeezed his hand under the table, smiled, whispered, "You're my whole world, John. John." Then John knew he didn't need to chase others' success. He was free to live with love, truth, kindness, and sincerity as the God within him intended. John's holy defiance showed in choices that seemed small but carried deep weight, like when he declined a profitable deal with a big auto chain because they wanted him to overcharge struggling customers. "That's not how I do business," John said, voice calm but firm. John nodded firmly. The rep sneered, called him stubborn. John walked away from that meeting, his chest lighter, as if unburdened. He knew that choice didn't just save his shop, it shielded his soul's temple where God dwells, where honesty and kindness are its pillars. Another time at a town meeting, John overheard folks gossiping about Tommy, his apprentice, calling him a troubled dropout with no future. John, who rarely outspoken in such talk, felt his blood rise. He stepped up, voice low but clear. "Tommy's a good kid. He's trying, and I'll bet he'll do great." John nodded, unwavering. The crowd hushed. Some looked sheepish. John nodded firmly. Later, Tommy, hearing of this, thanked John, eyes red. "You're the first who believed in me," he said. John just nodded, but inside freedom swelled freedom to stand for right, to see God's light in those the world scorned. This freedom wasn't free John. There were days John grappled with himself, with fear of judgment, with doubts about his path. Like yesterday when his daughter wrote of maybe quitting her job for her art passion. John's gut urged safety, urging her to stay secure. But he paused, wrote back at the kitchen table, "Sweetheart, I trust you'll find your way. Follow what sings your heart sing." John smiled softly. As he mailed it, he felt a piece of himself freed, the part once tied by fear of failure by the world's unwritten rules. Under the oak, John shut his eyes, breathing deep. He felt like a bird loosed from its cage wings, weaker than in youth, but soaring to his heart's beat. He didn't need to please all, didn't need to flaunt worth with riches. He was free to live as God's plan within him, kindly, honestly, lovingly, truly. And that holy defiance he saw was how he proclaimed his soul a temple, bearing God's light wherever he went. John stood dusting his jeans, dust from his jeans, and walked on. The path took him past a field of swaying white wildflowers swaying. He thought of Mary's morning smile, of Mary, of her morning smile, of Tommy's spark fixing a car, of Tommy, of Bill finding hope in simple talks. All were part of his John's quiet revolution, a revolution through small acts, brave choices. As the sun rose higher, John headed home. He saw Mary in garden, her apron dirt-streaked. John approached, hugged her from behind, whispered, "Beautiful day, huh?" She laughed, leaning back. They shared a tender moment. In that moment, John felt utterly free, not free from all burdens, but free in living with his sacred light despite the world's chains. And with that freedom, he knew his simple life was a hymn to God resonating forever. The sun sank behind the hills, painting the small town's sky a blazing orange, as if heaven itself were bending to kiss the earth. John stood on the porch, holding an old ceramic mug, the coffee's warmth seeping into his rough hands. Mary's laughter echoed from the kitchen, where she talked on the phone with their daughter, her voice brimming with joy. Across the street, Helen's light glowed, and John glimpsed her watering plants through the window. A soft breeze carried the scent of cut grass, and in this moment, John felt a profound wholeness. Not because his life was perfect, but because he had learned to live with the sacred light in his heart. John's life, if told, wouldn't stun anyone. He was no hero from stories, no preacher on a stage, no titan of business. He was a mechanic in an old wooden house with a modest garage and a family he loved more than anything. But through God's eyes, his life was a masterpiece, a song of faith, a canvas of kindness, a lighthouse for lost souls. Every day he lived, every choice he made, from fixing a car for a struggling customer, listening to Bill in his loneliness, to holding Mary through life's storms, was a stroke on the sacred tapestry where God had penned his tale. Today, as John looked out over the familiar path, he thought of those who'd crossed his life. Tommy the apprentice, now a skilled mechanic, still dropped by to thank him. His son, who came home this summer, gave a tight hug and a late apology. And Mary, who'd stood by him through every high and low, her smile as radiant as when they met. All of them in some way were lamps John had lit, not with fanfare, but through how he lived, true, kind, faithful. John never thought himself special, but he'd grasped a deep truth, and every person is a temple bearing God's light, and their mission, humble or grand, isn't for rivalry, but to shine uniquely, touching lives with love and hope. For John, that mission was his garage evenings with Mary, moments when he paused to aid a stranger. He didn't need to reshape the world for his world, the people he loved. His actions had already shifted in ways heaven could smile upon. As dusk faded, John stepped inside, setting the mug on the kitchen table. Mary looked up, ending her call, asked, "What kept you out there so long?" He smiled, sat beside her, said, "Just feeling grateful, hon." He didn't elaborate, but in his heart a silent song played, a hymn of an ordinary man who'd lived extraordinarily, letting God guide him. He knew, come what may, he'd keep walking the sacred flame in his heart, a beacon never dimming, lighting the way for him and those needing light. The wooden house fell still, only the clock's tick and their steady breaths remained, weaving a beautiful tale of two souls. Outside, the town slept under a starry sky, and somewhere John's lighthouse glowed quietly, reminding all that every life, simple as it is a miracle, a testament to God's presence on earth.